My name is Doris Harper, and I've lived a full life, though not always as I had imagined it. Now, I run a small herb shop in the quiet town of Willow Creek. People know me as the gentle, kind woman who offers remedies for all sorts of ailments. The kind of woman you can trust, the kind you turn to when life weighs heavy. But behind my warm smile and the soothing sense of my little shop, there's a history that might surprise those who think they know me. I wasn't always a healer. In fact, I never thought I'd be doing this at all. I grew up in a working-class family, the youngest of 3. My mother was always busy, cleaning, cooking, working around the house, while my father spent his days in the fields. They never had time for anything other than survival. And so, at an early age, I learned to be self-sufficient. I worked hard, scrubbing floors, doing dishes, and learning the ways of the world, quietly hoping for something more. When I became a mother, everything changed. My son Mark was my whole world. He was everything I had ever dreamed of, everything I hoped for when I was younger. I devoted myself to him, sacrificed everything I had to make sure he never went without. I worked endless hours at the factory, sewing fabrics, the repetitive hum of the machine echoing in my mind. All I wanted was for him to have a better life than I did, to have the opportunities one never had. For years it was just the 2 of us. Mark was the joy of my life, my reason for enduring the hardships, for waking up every day and giving everything I had. And he was my rock, at least I thought he was. As time passed, I watched him grow into a young man. The bond between us seemed unbreakable, or so I believed. Then one day everything changed. It happened when I was 72 years old. A stroke took away the life I had worked so hard to build. One moment I was standing at the counter preparing herbs for a client, and the next I was on the floor, unable to move, feeling as though the world had shifted beneath me. I couldn't speak, couldn't move my right side, and the room felt far away. The doctors said it was a stroke, and just like that I was no longer in control of my life. And that's when Mark stepped in. First I was so grateful. He told me I didn't have to worry, that he would take care of me. "I'm your son, Mom," he said. "You've always taken care of me. Now it's my turn." He moved in, started helping me with everything. Feeding me, taking me to the bathroom, dressing me. For a while it felt like a blessing. I couldn't do it on my own, and he was there, promising to stay with me, never leave me. He said he wouldn't allow anyone else to care for me. He was all I needed. I believed him. After all, he was my son. He was the one I had raised, the one I had loved unconditionally. It was natural, right? He wanted to care for me. I thought that's what family did. Took care of each other. But as the days turned into weeks, I started to notice things that made me uncomfortable. Small things at first, barely noticeable. A touch that lingered too long, a look that didn't feel quite right. But I told myself I was just being paranoid. After all, he was my son. And he had always been so affectionate. He was just worried about me. But then the massages started. I didn't understand it at first. He said it was to help with the stiffness in my body, to relieve the tension. But every time his hands lingered on my chest or too close to places I wasn't comfortable with, I felt a creeping discomfort. I tried to brush it off, tried to pretend everything was fine. But it wasn't fine. The longer this went on, the more it became clear that something was wrong. I couldn't escape the feeling that he wasn't just taking care of me. He was controlling me. And he was using my dependence against me, using the very love I had given him for years as a tool for his own gain. I was paralyzed. I couldn't move freely, couldn't defend myself. But I was aware, could feel everything. And every day, as his touches became more invasive, more manipulative, I realized that he was no longer the boy I had raised with love. He was someone else now, someone dangerous, someone I no longer recognized. And so, my dear friends, that's where it began. The beginning of the end of my silence. The beginning of the fight for my dignity, for my strength. But how could I confront my own flesh and blood? How could I admit to myself what he was doing? The truth was a bitter pill to swallow, but it was one I had to face. And soon, very soon, I would find the courage to confront him. The days that followed my realization felt like they were dragging me deeper into a place I couldn't escape from. At first, it had all seemed so innocent. Mark's care, his promise to look after me. It was supposed to be the love of a son for his mother. But now, every touch, every word, every glance felt like a lie. A manipulation designed to slowly suffocate the person I had once been. You know, there are moments in life when everything shifts, and you realize that nothing is as it seems. And that moment came for me when I looked into my son's eyes and saw something I hadn't expected. Something foreign, something cold. It wasn't the boy I had raised, the one who had kissed me goodnight when he was little, the one who used to tell me about his day at school. No, the person standing before me was someone else. Stranger. A stranger who knew every detail of my life, every weakness, and was using that knowledge against me. I thought I had seen the worst of life. My stroke had taken so much from me. My independence, my strength. But I had no idea that the real nightmare was just beginning. As the days turned into weeks, I started noticing more subtle changes in his behavior. Things that, at first, I dismissed as part of the process of caregiving. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the creeping dread that was starting to gnaw at my insides. It was the little things. The way his touch lingered too long when he helped me with basic tasks. The way he would stand a little too close to me when there was no need. His breath hot against my neck. The way he looked at me like I was more than just his mother. The hugs, which had always been a source of comfort, now felt like chains that wrapped around my chest, constricting my breath. But what truly frightened me was how easily he brushed off my discomfort. Every time I said something, tried to explain that I didn't feel right, he would laugh and say, "You're just being paranoid, Mom. You've been through a lot. You need to relax." And I did relax. I allowed myself to believe that I was just imagining things. I tried to convince myself that it was all part of the caregiving process. After all, wasn't I just a burden on him now? Wasn't he just trying to help me? But the truth was becoming too obvious to deny. As his touch became more frequent and invasive, my body tensed with fear. I started avoiding him, finding excuses to leave the room, to lock the door behind me. But even then, I couldn't escape his presence. I couldn't escape the fact that I was trapped, not just in a physical sense, but emotionally too. I was no longer able to distinguish between what was right and wrong, what was care and what was manipulation. I was losing myself piece by piece, and he was the one holding the knife. And the worst part, I couldn't even fight back. I was paralyzed, physically and emotionally. How could I confront the very person who I had trusted most in the world? One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, Mark came into my room again. He was carrying the same air of confidence, the same fake concern that had become so familiar. "Mom, I love you," he said, as he pulled me into another one of those suffocating, lingering hugs. I felt my heart race, a cold sweat forming on my skin. This time I couldn't let it slide. I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that had built up inside me. With shaking hands, I pulled away from him. "Mark, I can't do this anymore," I said, my voice trembling. "This isn't care. This isn't love. I feel like I'm being suffocated." He looked at me, confused, almost hurt. "Mom, I'm just trying to help you. Why are you making this so hard?" His words echoed in my ears, but I was no longer the fool who would fall for them. "I don't want your help if it means feeling like this. You're not helping me. You're hurting me." For a moment there was silence. The weight of what I had just said hung between us like a storm cloud, heavy and ominous. Then Mark's face shifted, his expression hardening into something I hadn't seen before. "You don't understand," he said, his voice cold. "I've been nothing but patient with you. You're just too ungrateful." I felt the ground beneath me shift as a terrifying realization settled into my bones. He wasn't just caring for me. He was controlling me. He wasn't a son showing love to his mother. He was a predator using my dependence as a weapon. And I had been too blind to see it. I wanted to scream, to push him away, to run. But I was paralyzed, not just by my body, but by the years of love, sacrifice, and trust one had given him. How could I reconcile what he had become with the child I had raised with so much hope? And yet, in that moment, something inside me snapped. It was as if I could see through the fog of my own self-doubt, through the confusion he had planted in my mind. I wasn't just a victim of his actions. I was a victim of my own fear. Fear that had kept me silent for far too long. This was it. The moment when I would stop pretending. When I would stop doubting my own reality. I couldn't change what had happened, but I could change the future. I couldn't stay trapped in this nightmare any longer. And so, as Mark stood there, trying to manipulate me with his guilt and his words, I realized that it was time to take back my power. It was time to face the truth, no matter how painful. I was not helpless. I was not weak. And I would not let him control me anymore. That evening, when I finally understood that my son was no longer the person I had once believed him to be, marked a turning point in my life. I sat in my chair, looking at him as he calmly stood beside me, believing that I would fall under his control once again, just as I had done before. His smile was so convincing that, at times, I started to doubt my own feelings. The thought crept into my mind, maybe this is just my paranoia? But no. I knew that it wasn't. Mark had begun to twist the truth like a serpent. He manipulated my emotions so expertly that it was no longer easy to separate where his truth ended and where his lies began. It hurt, and I couldn't speak a word, but my heart was heavy with a burden I could no longer carry. I saw how he was losing all fear of my anger, as I no longer had the strength to fight back. He began forcing me to lock myself away from the world even more. He insisted that I had no right to speak with anyone, no calls, no visits, no friends. He said it was for my own good. At first I tried to accept it as his way of caring, but then I realized. He was preventing me from staying connected to reality. It was a trap. Another one of his manipulations came when he started controlling what I ate, when I ate, and how much I ate. One day he came to me with a new dietary plan, convincing me that it would help me recover faster. Though in truth, it was nothing but another way for him to exert even more control over me. Every day I began to feel more like an object, less like a human being. I remember one night that became the last straw. It was late in the evening, and I lay in bed when, as usual, Mark came in, looking for some reason to stay by my side. "Mom, I'm so worried about you. You should be thankful that I'm here and taking care of you," he said, as I tried to push him away. His words were as fake as his smile. I remembered the boy he used to be, the one who promised to protect me when he grew up. Where was that child who once kissed me goodnight and promised always to be there for me? Now, he was just a part of the destructive system that had been built around me. I began locking myself away, retreating from his constant pressure. But something inside me began to change. Perhaps it was my spirit, which refused to let me surrender. I started to realize that I couldn't bear this treatment any longer. I had given him everything over the years, and now he was just tormenting me with my helplessness. The next morning, when he came into my room again to check on whether I was following his dietary plan, I made a decision. I said, "Mark, enough. I won't let you control my life anymore. I am not your property, and you have no right to do whatever you want with me." His face changed. This wasn't the same son who had once hugged me tenderly and promised love and care. No, this was a cold, angry man who tried to break me using my dependency. He began to argue, claiming that he loved me, that all of this was for my own good, but his words sounded hollow. I no longer had any fear. I was ready to fight for my life because I understood now. He had been using my weakness to impose his will on me. Now that I understood what he was doing, I was no longer afraid of change. This was the moment I began to find my power again. I had no more doubts, no more confusion. It was time to fight for my dignity, my autonomy, and my future. It was time to make sure that Mark would no longer have the control he thought he held over me. The battle had only just begun. I remember that day clearly. The day I realized that I could no longer remain in the shadow of my son, forced to endure his dominance and manipulation. I no longer cared about what he would say or how he would react. That day marked the moment when I finally decided to set a boundary. I no longer cared how it would be received. I knew one thing. I would not remain silent anymore. It happened late at night when it was just the two of us left in the house. I lay in bed, watching the moonlight shine through the window, unable to sleep because of the constant anxiety that haunted me. Suddenly, I heard the door creak open softly. I knew who it was, my son. "Mom, I brought you some tea. You wouldn't want me to leave you alone, would you?" he asked, trying to sound caring. But his words no longer carried that warmth they once had. I couldn't hold back any longer. The feeling of entitlement, the disrespect for my boundaries, overwhelmed me. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, and I said firmly, "Mark, I don't want you here. I won't allow you to manipulate me anymore. You no longer have power over me. I am not your dependent." I watched his reaction closely. I wondered if he understood that I was no longer the woman I had once been. He went silent. For a few seconds there was a heavy silence in the room, but it was a comforting one, almost like the calm before a storm. He stood in front of me, and I could see his face change. The confident demeanor he once wore was gone. Now he looked bewildered and confused. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The entire time, his gaze was fixed on mine, as if he was trying to understand whether I was serious. But I was serious, and I knew that I couldn't retreat anymore. I heard him take a step back, and trying to regain his composure, he muttered, "You're just imagining things again, Mom. You're too tired. Just accept my help. I don't want you to think that I'm trying to limit you." Those words meant nothing to me. They only underscored how deeply he had twisted my reality. He was saying what I wanted to hear to calm me down, but I was no longer the same. I took a deep breath and responded, "You want to help? Leave me alone and stop coming into my room without asking. That's how you help me. You no longer have the right to touch me without my permission." I knew these words would make him angrier, but I could no longer stay silent. He fell quiet for a while, then gathered his thoughts and said, "You want me to leave? Fine, I'll go." And he left the room. I was left alone, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. Now, I knew I would not let him use me again. This wasn't just a verbal confrontation. It was my fight for freedom, for the right to be not just a mother, but a woman who had dignity and respect. As I sat alone in the silence, I began preparing myself for the journey ahead. I didn't know what would happen next, but I could feel that I now had the strength to act. I no longer depended on him. I could see, with every moment, that I was becoming stronger, more confident. The responsibility for my life was mine alone now. And then I made a decision. I would no longer stay silent with this horrible secret, and I certainly wouldn't be a victim of the one person who should have protected me. I knew I had to find a way to rid myself of this situation once and for all. I could no longer endure this silence. For so many years I had been deceived by his words, and now the time had come when I could no longer remain in ignorance. I realized that this step, the one I was about to take, was decisive. I was ready not only to resist but to expose the truth, even though it was terrifying. After that night when I finally said, "Enough," I understood that for everything to change, I had to find a way to lift the curtain and show the world what he had been doing to me. I could no longer keep this secret within. I could not allow this evil to stay hidden any longer. But with every step I took in this direction, I felt my heart tighten with fear. What if no one believed me? Mark, perhaps sensing the shift in my behavior, became more cautious. He stopped entering my room without permission, although he still found ways to influence my life through subtle, underhanded tactics. He began to show his concern again, but I no longer had any desire to accept his manipulations. I tried to stay calm, but inside a storm was brewing. I couldn't live in this trap anymore, so I decided to reach out to people who could help me. The first person I chose to tell was my old friend Laura, whom I had known since we worked together at the factory. Laura was a woman with an old soul. She understood what it meant to endure hardships. I didn't expect any judgment from her, and she truly didn't let me down. She listened to me without interruption, taking every word I spoke to heart, and when I finished telling my story, she hugged me tightly and said, "Doris, you're not alone. You've made the first step. I'll help you." With Laura by my side, I began to plan my next steps. She suggested I contact a lawyer to figure out what to do legally. I was overwhelmed with fear when I thought about what might happen. What if everything went wrong? What if I ended up alone and powerless again? But Laura was with me, and that gave me strength. We reached out to a local lawyer who specialized in cases involving victims of abuse. He listened to my story with great care, nodding along as I spoke. After our conversation, he asked me whether I could prove that my words were the truth. I explained that all I had was my experience and my testimony. But of course, that wasn't enough for evidence. He advised me to consult medical experts to gather physical proof that could support my claims. The next day I went to see a doctor. He performed an examination and took note of both my physical and emotional scars. He observed signs of psychological abuse, and he noted some injuries that could have been caused by Mark's manipulative behavior. This was my first victory. My words were starting to become facts that couldn't be ignored. I was terrified, but I knew that I could no longer leave this without consequences. And then I took the most important step. I decided to contact the police. While I was shaking with fear, the police did their part. They began the investigation. And although Mark tried to deny everything, I knew that the truth could not be buried in the shadows. A few days later, Mark was arrested. And while he continued to deny all the charges, I was no longer the same woman who had stayed silent. I had my share of the truth, and now it was his problem, not mine. He looked confused and angry as the police escorted him out of the house. He shouted that I had made everything up, that it was all because of my bad condition. I knew this was his last attempt to manipulate me, but I was no longer his victim. I was trembling with nerves, but I also felt relief. I had doubts about whether everything would go smoothly, whether the investigation would unfold as planned, but I knew one thing. I was no longer alone. I had people who believed in me, who had my back. The days that followed were a blur, filled with interviews with detectives, visits to the lawyer's office, and moments where I would sit alone, lost in my thoughts, wondering what would come next. I didn't know if the truth would be enough to bring him to justice. But something inside me was different now. I wasn't afraid of him anymore. I wasn't afraid of the consequences. It wasn't just the legal process I had to fight. It was the emotional turmoil that I had been carrying for so long. But now that I had taken the first step, I began to feel the weight of that burden lifting. I began to feel like I had a chance at something more, something better than what I had been enduring. Every time I thought about the years I had spent in silence, enduring his cruelty, I felt anger rise up inside me. But with that anger came strength. And with that strength, I knew that I could make sure this would never happen again. Not to me and not to anyone else. As the investigation progressed, I began to see a glimmer of hope. The evidence that had once seemed so elusive was now undeniable. More people came forward, people who had witnessed things I hadn't even known were happening, neighbors who had seen the isolation Mark imposed on me, workers at the local pharmacy who had seen the strange behavior he exhibited when picking up medications. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, and I could feel the momentum building. The day the trial began, I found myself standing in front of a judge, a woman who had seen far too many cases like mine. She looked at me with compassion as I told my story in front of the court. Mark sat across from me, still denying everything. His face twisted in a mixture of anger and disbelief. He had never expected me to fight back. He had thought that because of my condition, I would remain his prisoner forever. But I was free now. Free from his manipulations. Free from his lies. The verdict came a few weeks later. Mark was convicted of abuse, manipulation, and exploitation. He was sentenced to a long prison term. When I heard the verdict, I didn't feel happiness. Felt relief. The victory was not in the punishment he received. It was in the fact that I had found the courage to stand up for myself. It was in the fact that I had taken back my life. And that, my dear friends, was the moment I truly started living again. After Mark was arrested, I felt relief. But it wasn't the end of my story. It was only the beginning of my true recovery. It seemed like I had endured the worst, the physical pain, the deep emotional scars. But there was still the journey through the system, the investigation, the trial, and everything that came after. My internal battle was far from over. I was left alone with a new challenge. How to live now that the whole world knew the truth? How could I shake off the fear I had carried inside me all these years? I couldn't just rest and be happy that it was over. I understood that I still had to go through this process, but now I was ready. I remember sitting on a bench outside my little shop, trying to gather my thoughts, when Laura brought me the news. The trial was still ongoing, but the lawyer had said that even though Mark had tried to get out on bail, he was still sentenced to a real prison term. Justice was beginning to prevail, but that didn't mean everything was finished. I had no illusions about how hard it would be to find peace within myself again. This was not just a process of punishment. This was my recovery. I realized that I now had more than just a victory in court. I had true freedom. Freedom from fear, from manipulation, from pain. Freedom from his pressure, from constantly being under his control. And now I could build my life anew. My little shop, where I sold herbs and natural remedies, had become a sanctuary for me, a place of strength where I could not only help others but also restore myself. Every day, I discovered more and more joy in the simple fact that I was once again in control of my life. I started developing new skills, creating new recipes that could help people. And I no longer feared his looks or his manipulations. With Laura, we created a small support group for women who had survived abuse. It became my way of regaining a sense of purpose and helping others find the strength to break free from the traps they were in. I understood how important it was to be not just a victim but also a support for those going through similar experiences. But the best part was that I began to notice small joys in my daily routine again. I started smiling once more, seeing the colors around me, and tasting the sweetness of life. It was a process that took time, but I knew that while the past couldn't be erased, I could learn to live with it. And one day, as I sat in my shop, arranging herbs on the shelves, I noticed that the world around me had changed. I felt a deep sense of renewal. In that moment, I realized that the legal victory wasn't the only thing that mattered. The most important thing was that I had restored myself. I had taken back control over my life. I had endured, survived, and now I was living again. For the first time in years, I could breathe freely. And I knew deep down that this was just the beginning of the rest of my life. I sat in my little shop, surrounded by the familiar scent of herbs and the comforting hum of life around me. Each day that passed, I could feel myself becoming the woman I had always wanted to be. A woman who was strong, independent, and free. The true process of recovery hadn't begun immediately, but now, as I looked at my life, I could see that I had found my way to inner peace. I had finally begun to rid myself of the pain I had carried for years. Mark was now part of the past. His manipulations, his lies, his abuse, everything was left behind. He was no longer part of my world. I lived without him, free from the constant fear he had created. My reality was once again mine to shape, and I could decide what to do and how to live. With each passing day, I felt myself growing stronger. Every small victory, whether it was a new recipe I created for my customers or a new plant I had cultivated, filled my heart with joy. And in that moment, when I began to trust people and myself again, life gave me another gift. I was preparing a delivery for one of my regular customers when I noticed a man standing at the door. He was looking curiously at the display window, but there was something about him that made me pause. He was older, yet his smile was so warm that I couldn't help but feel drawn to him. He introduced himself as Mr. Anthony, a simple, thoughtful man who had recently lost his wife and was looking for natural remedies to soothe his nerves. We started talking, and I quickly realized that this man was genuinely kind and attentive. He listened to me without interrupting, and that feeling of being truly heard was something I hadn't experienced in years. After all the years of fighting against people who only used my patience and kindness for their own gain, Mr. Anthony was like a breath of fresh air. He began coming to my shop every morning, bringing me flowers, just because. No reason other than a simple act of kindness. It was a symbol of something I had forgotten existed. People who could be sincere, people who didn't manipulate or take advantage. And with each passing day, I found myself looking forward to seeing him. His presence was comforting and his care was genuine. It was so different from anything I had experienced in so long. One evening we sat together in a small cafe, laughing from the heart, and I suddenly realized that this new chapter in my life was a true gift, a gift I had earned through all the pain and struggle I had endured. All those years of fighting hadn't been in vain. Now I had peace in my heart. I was ready for new beginnings, without the burden of pain, without the betrayal. As I looked across the table at Mr. Anthony, I realized that this was what I had longed for. Someone who respected me, who saw me for who I truly was, not as a victim, but as a woman deserving of love and kindness. We shared a quiet moment, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a sense of belonging, of being cherished. And yet, as much as I had healed, I also knew that my past would never truly leave me. My heart would never forget what had happened, the suffering I had endured, and the lessons I had learned. But now it didn't define me anymore. It wasn't the lens through which I saw the world. It had become a part of my story, a part of who I was, but it no longer dictated my every thought. I had become the woman I was always meant to be. I had fought through hell, and now I was walking in the light again. And that light, for the first time, felt like it belonged to me. When I returned to my shop that evening, closed the door behind me, and turned off the lights, I took one last deep breath. I was free. There was nothing that could break me anymore. I was living for myself, for my new dreams and hopes. I had found my strength, and with it, I was building a life that was mine to live, without fear, without shame, without doubt. I had reclaimed my dignity and my purpose. The shop had become more than just a business. It was my sanctuary, my space to nurture not only the plants and remedies but also the healing I still needed. Every day felt like a new opportunity to create something beautiful and meaningful, and every new customer, every new plant, every new day was another step forward. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was walking through the past, burdened by its weight. Instead, I was walking toward a future that was open, bright, and full of possibility. I wasn't just a survivor anymore. I was a woman reborn. And so, as I sat in the quiet of my little shop, the dim light of the evening settling around me, I thought about all that I had overcome. I thought about the pain and the heartbreak, but more than anything, I thought about how far I had come. I had reclaimed my life, my power, and my peace. I, Doris Harper, at 72 years old, could finally say that I was truly free. And this was just the beginning of the rest of my life.